Gun Rights Radio Network has the best pro-Second Amendment, pro-gun rights podcast available on the net. The podcasts are absolutely free when subscribing using iTunes or Zune Marketplace. Or if you want, you can just listen from the website. Make sure you visit gunrightsradio.com to subscribe. Podcasting freedom, one episode at a time.
Hey, welcome back to Power Factor. I'm Steve.
I'm Rick.
And today we're going to talk about dry fire practice, some of the things that we do. Dry fire, I think, is really an important part of a shooter's repertoire of tools that they have. I personally dry fire probably about 3 or 4 times a week. I'd probably do it more if I could, for about 15 to 20 minutes each day. I think there's some benefits of around that figure for amount of time that you want to spend. If you start going too much longer than that, I think you kind of lose interest. I think a lot of people actually lose interest in dry fire to begin with. It's kind of a tough thing to just stay in your house and pretend like you're shooting holes into a target. It's boring, I'll admit that. But there are certain things that you can kind of do and exercises and whatnot to kind of make it a little more interesting. But the problem is that if you start going too long, you do get fatigued because you literally are pretty much active during that whole entire period of either whatever you're working on, whether it's draws, reloads, target, transitions, presentation of the gun to the target and everything. You're constantly doing that for 20 minutes. If you're amping it up to the next level of doing dry fire practice where you're actually moving between simulated shooting boxes or starting in a chair or starting behind a table or whatever, where you're dynamically moving within your house, assuming you have the ability to do that, it can even be more taxing for a 20-minute period. So 20 minutes seems to be a good average number in terms of the amount of time that you should spend on dry fire at any given session.
And I find that the dry fire practice that I do, unfortunately, is not especially structured. I'll do it kind of when I have a chance, and I'll practice what I can depending on where I am and what I'm doing. If I'm out in the garage, I'm pretty free to do what I want, but there's still limitations to the distance I can get from a target, or even just things like dropping loaded mags on the floor and things you just have to, I don't want to be running around dropping my mags on a loaded mags on a concrete floor. And that's just a matter of something you just have to kind of adapt. Like when my family's gone, I can run around in the family room and drop them on a carpeted floor. So it's just kind of, I'll grab what dry fire practice I can, just based on where and when I can do it.
But one actually response to your dropping magazines, what I do in dry fire for reload practice is I will start with the gun empty, no magazine in the gun. Mm-hmm. So my first, I basically force myself to hit the mag release button and then pull my magazine and load it in the gun. So as long as I'm not doing multiple reloads as I'm trying to do my stage, I'm not really dropping a magazine. I'm simulating dropping a magazine, but not actually physically dropping one. And you still get the benefit of reloading the gun. Yeah. And that does help because it is tedious that after you've done this, you have to pick up all your magazines off the ground or whatever. And, it's a hassle. And again, dry fire is no fun. And we want to do something that at least makes it, if you come into this with, I hate doing dry fire, you're not going to do dry fire. So if you can at least minimize the hate factor to a certain degree, it makes it that much better. Yeah. So in terms of dry fire, in my house and where I'm able to do dry fire, I do it in my family room, and I can actually get about 12 yards from where I like to do my dry fire to. I have actually a fireplace as my backstop, which is good. And again, rules on dry fire is make sure your gun is clear, make sure it's clear again, and still make sure it's clear if you leave the room, come back into the room, verify your chamber is still clear. It's weird how stuff happens and ammo finds its way into guns.
And some people go so far as to they never take live ammo into the part of the house where they do their dry fire. Right. And they never take their dry fire gun out of the dry fire room. It's almost like they try to compartmentalize it to help ensure that there's never live ammo near the gun when they're dry firing, and the gun never goes where the ammo is.
Right. And that's definitely a key thing to try to get yourself into that mindset of making sure that there is no ammo around the gun whatsoever. But even if you go into that approach of saying there is no ammo around the gun, it's bizarre how something can happen. Why, if you step out or do something or whatever and come back in, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but rule of thumb that I always have of when I pick up a gun, I make sure the chamber's empty no matter what. That's just what I get into. So, and anyway,
keep checking it.
Yeah,
that's the other thing.
Yeah, don't just assume that it is. Check that it is.
Get in the habit of checking it.
Right. So after getting through the safety portion there, and what I do in terms of dry fire is I use full-size IPSC targets at the proper distance. So I put my targets out at 12 yards. in my house, and I typically have 3 of them spaced about 2 to 3 feet apart across my fireplace, and I have one other one that is positioned off to the side, and then I used a Japanese statue that's way off in the back corner of my yard as my 25-yard target.
Now, what if it was like a Norwegian statue?
Well, then I...
On a similar note, I use these. This is the target for my dry fire practice. I use 1/3 scale targets. And
You're preparing for midgets, right?
the advantage of it is that you can essentially, if you're talking about trying to replicate distances for a specific course of fire, you can just translate yards into feet. And so I can litter my garage with various arrays of targets. It doesn't take up nearly as much room as full-size targets, but what's the shortcoming of having this 1/3 smaller at 1/3 the distance?
Yeah, so the thing there, and that's kind of gets in the reason of why I use full-size targets, is dry fire is not only learning to find the target and get a proper trigger press. The beauty of the 1/3 size targets is obviously that you can compress, assuming that you're in a position where you don't have the ability to have 12 yards or whatever distance between you and your targets, but you're literally 1/3 the distance. If you have a compact area, that may be all you can do. But the problem with doing that is that part of dry fire and part of shooting is that your vision finds a target and then comes back to the front sight and then breaks a shot. When you're dealing with a 1/3 size target and you're looking at 1/3 the distance, your vision isn't transitioning the full distance that it would normally transition in a real stage or real life scenario where you would normally be seeing normal shooting occurring. So for that reason, I find that using full-size targets at the correct distance replicates everything that I would typically see in a course of fire. My vision is transitioning all the way from the target to the front sight. I'm seeing the front sight on the target as if it were on a stage. So really from a standpoint of a mental aspect, my mind during dry fire is seeing the exact same thing that it would in a typical course of fire, and it's not having to simulate anything. What I'm seeing in dry fire is what I'm seeing in a course.
Yeah, and then the flip side of that, of course, is you can set up an entire course of fire, a complex course of fire in your garage if you're doing it at 1/3 scale. My garage is about 40 feet wide. I've got pillars that I can negotiate around, so I can set up what would simulate a 20-round course of fire in an area that's 10 by 10 feet, because I don't have to get so far away from the targets and because they don't have to be so far apart. But you're also then losing something like Steve said, and there's no reason you can't do a combination of both. You can still do your back and forth practice on a full-size target, even get it out to 10 yards. But the compressing a course of fire, it has some value too, even if it doesn't simulate everything.
And when you go to a match away from home, as crazy as this sounds, and just to give you an idea of how homely we probably are, we will both bring reduced size dry fire targets and typically stick them on the headboard or whatever and do dry fire practice in the hotel room the night before we shoot, and each night typically before the next day's shooting, and even in the morning before we go out and shoot. Yeah. It's just a good way to get warmed up and get familiar with the gun and just get your draw down and your grip down and all that stuff. I think it's really beneficial from that standpoint.
And one of the things about when you go to a practical match is there is no opportunity to do any kind of warm-up. There's no place where you're going to be able to go and fire a few rounds. You can go to the safety area and practice some draws and do a little dry firing to the back wall that's 2 feet away. But if you want to get any kind of just a little bit of warm-up, you're going to have to do that probably before you go to the range. And personally, I generally do most of my dry fire, if I'm going to do it, either the day before a match or a couple of days just prior to the match, so it's still kind of fresh. It used to be I shot sometimes two or three matches a week, and so I never felt like I was really out of practice. But in the winter, and sometimes I might shoot one match a month, and so I don't like that sense of, I haven't shot a gun for a week. I haven't had a gun in my hand for a week. So like if the match is on Sunday, Saturday afternoon sometime, I'll take the gun out and work with it for 20 minutes or so just to kind of get that familiarity back from not having shot for a while.
So what I typically work on in dry fire practice, there's a lot of different things you can, I should probably start out here. There's a book by a guy by the name of Steve Anderson called Refinement and Repetition. I think he's actually come out with a second book after this one. But he has a lot of exercises in here that you can set up. He also recommends using full-size targets. He talks about basically he has a start time, a par time, and then when you start pushing yourself You can record all the information down, but he has just quite a few different examples in here of courses of fire, I think 30 some that you can set up, simulating plate racks, simulating multiple targets, simulating movement, things of that nature. So a book like this, really for people who say, well, what am I going to practice, or what should I do, or I just don't want to stand there and pull a trigger on targets, this would be a good starting point to come up with just a bunch of different ideas and information about how to do dry fire. So when doing dry fire in a situation like that, you're going to probably use a timer. And obviously, since the timer is not going to pick up any rounds that are fired, we can't do that. Typically what we do is we set a par time. So you set a par time for basically whatever exercise you're going to do. And then let's say it's drawing. You want to see how fast you can draw to a single target. So you set a par time of 0.8 seconds, and you draw, and if you finish
1.8 seconds.
Okay. And you draw, and if you're under that 1.8 seconds, great, you beat it. And then you might want to drop it down to 1.7 or 1.6.
And you can program whatever part time you want into the timer. You can measure your improvement by shortening the time, but programming the time in there that's a reasonable target. For a beginner, that's why Steve said 0.8 for your draw,
Yeah.
and 1.8 is certainly much more realistic for a new shooter.